Enclosures are a huge part of the jazz tradition, and not so much in pop music. We can agree on that the enclosure, called a chromatic enclosure or chromatic approach notes, is one of the very important tools to know in jazz that really makes the jazz sound happen. In almost all of the bars in Charlie Parker's solo on Confirmation, he puts an enclosure, this be a diatonic or chromatic enclosure. So obviously the enclosure is super important in jazz music. When you're going to practice the enclosure, there's a couple of basic things you need to know. The enclosure is tones moving towards a target note, but just not any notes. The enclosure is enclosing the target note, so coming from both below and above. To define it really simply, the enclosure is basically a third interval moving towards the target note in the middle. There can also be other intervals, but basically a third interval. So when you want to get into the enclosure, a great thing to practice is thirds in the scale. And this is the basic training to get into enclosures in your playing. Slowly begin to compose lines or play lines where you're enclosing some of the target notes you want to hit with thirds in the scale. AKA third intervals around the target notes you want to hit. When getting into this approach, you can play really cool jazz lines. And the trick is pretty simple, just encircle the target notes with third intervals in the beginning. The next step in discovering and learning the full extent of the disclosure is this beautiful line of Charlie Parker. Just add a chromatic approach note in front of the line you're going to play. And this half step is a much stronger leading tone than the whole step you sometimes get when you're playing thirds in the scale. So as you see, some places in the major scale, the half step is a naturally placed tone. Beginning to using these natural half steps in the scale is a great stepping stone to getting into these chromatic approach notes. The chromatic half step approach is found twice in the major scale. Start using these natural half steps in the beginning to get into the chromatic enclosure. Try using them like this, where I'm using the natural half steps leading into different lines. Here you see that I'm using the F sharp leading into the G, a natural half step. And I'm using the B leading into the C, also a natural half step in the major scale. Both approaches are on the A minor 7th chord, but you can use them everywhere as long as you fit it into the chords in the scale. Let's take this chromatic approach note a step further. You can easily just insert chromatic half steps below any note in the scale. Here I'm just adding chromatic notes under each arpeggio in the whole scale. When you have established the sound of the half step under each tone of the scale or under each arpeggio of the scale, start inserting these into your jazz licks. They sound amazing. And when you start using this chromatic approach, they also open up for other chromatic lines. You remember the exercise from earlier where we're adding thirds in the scale using these as the enclosures? And now we're actually making a diatonic approach note exercise out of it. Train both the ascending thirds and the descending thirds in the scale, making enclosure exercises out of it. And this really opens up for the enclosure sound and the technique. And now comes the chromatic trip. Turn the lowest approach note in the diatonic scale into a chromatic approach note. Do this throughout the whole scale exercise. And this gives you the chromatic enclosure feel. And slowly, when you're getting used to the chromatic sound, you see that you can use it everywhere in any of your lines you're playing. You see that I'm using extensive chromatic enclosures in this line. In the first bar, you see that I'm using enclosures with a diatonic step above and a chromatic step below. And the chromatics in bar 2 and 3 we'll get to in just a bit. So whenever you can, start constructing lines and insert these enclosures, chromatic enclosures, into your lines. I just want to mention that you do not need to figure out all this by yourself. In the lesson manual on Patreon, I have made some great shortcuts you can use. All the licks and all the exercise plus a tons more examples are written out in all 12 keys for you to get going on the material. Get it on Patreon, the link is in the description. In Charlie Parker's solo on Confirmation, he uses so many very beautiful enclosures, but this is really one of my favorites. This line is in two parts. The bit just before the target note is a chromatic approach with two notes up to the target note, and the first part is a diatonic third. But because of the diatonic half steps in the scale, you cannot apply this to all the tones in the scale because it sounds funny. So in this licks you get an outside chromatic approach towards the target note, and the sound is just a little bit less inside. On these 2 points in the scale where you have the diatonic half step, you can use this approach. You get a huge advantage in the sound, which is much more natural when you turn the enclosure around. You're still playing the diatonic third, but the enclosure is coming from above instead of below. But before getting into making lines with such a concept like this, remember to train it technically, that is down in your fingers and you have the sound in your ears. I really believe that you should train the technical part first, so this does not get in your way when you are playing the music. Now try slowly to incorporate these chromatic lines into the lines you're making. When you're using this particular enclosure, it's very important to identify the target note you're going to and then apply the right enclosure you want to use. Knowing these enclosures in more keys will really help you get them much better into your playing. In the lesson manual on Patreon, all the licks and all the exercises plus a bunch more is written out in all 12 keys, and this will give you a head start. Get it on Patreon, the link is in the description. I love the way Charlie Parker played. I love the way he handled bebop and how we can use so much of his playing still. I really recommend you to check out this video where I'm showing 3 great Charlie Parker techniques. Play music, have fun.